So in fact, if you want to refill your coffee, here's our 60-second countdown, and we'll begin our conversation today.
Just don't burn yourself with your coffee if you're trying to rush, please.
Safety first.
Absolutely.
Okay, Cammy, do you think we should go ahead and jump in? I think we should give people another minute.
I think we can get going. We've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time, so we might as well get moving.
Great. Okay, well, this is Chip Cleary. We'll introduce ourselves in just a minute, but I wanted to say once again, thanks for joining. We'll go ahead and get started. Today, we'd like to share a set of thoughts we've been working on about how to design a management development program that demonstrates real-world results, and how we make sure that we move beyond providing a training experience to really making sure that it makes a difference in the field with managers working with their teams. And been working on this series of ideas. We'll share them out with you. We'd love to get your feedback. So as we go through the conversation today, if you do have questions, please go ahead and pose them, and we'll be pausing from time to time to take questions. We hope to leave some time at the end for discussion too. So if we're not able to get to the questions during the course of the conversation, we'll make sure to get to them there when we get to the end. So just to give a sense of who's leading the discussion today. I'm Chip Cleary. I'm with Kineo. I'm our Vice President of Solutions and Consulting. Cammy, let me turn to you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Cammy. I'm the one on the right, Chip's the one on the left of your screen. And I am been with Kineo for 7 years and VP of Learning Design and a Solution Consultant. So excited to be here with you all today. And we've got Amber on today as well.
And yeah, Amber will be helping us facilitate the session and make sure we get to your questions. So Amber, do you want to say a quick hi? Oh, Amber may be on mute at this point, but we'll be turning from time to time to make sure that as you pose chat and pose questions that we make sure to turn to you. So why don't we go ahead and jump in? Cammy, let me ask you to kick us off.
Okay, great. So all of us, we're all training professionals. I think that's why you're all here today. And many of you in the audience have been targeted with leadership development programs in the past at some point. You've been put on a spot to develop a program for new frontline leaders. And, maybe you've done a great job. Maybe you've knocked it out of the park, or maybe you're here looking for some new ideas. As we kind of think about what's really critical about frontline leadership, we know that it matters, right? We know that engaging with those frontline leaders and giving them new skills and making them more effective means something to the bottom line of your business. The conference executive board did some research and came up with some really interesting numbers, and look at this second one here, right? So I'll put a little context, right? Like, I've written the book, The Accidental Instructional Designer, those of you who know me, right? People fall into roles by accident. It happens very often with management, right? You get promoted into this position because probably you're a good subject matter expert, or you show some leadership skills, but it turns out that people who get put into management positions are often really ill-equipped. We don't have the skills that we need to do that job. And what the CEB found, this engagement data is really, really important, that if we increase that employee performance, if an effective manager can improve that employee performance by 25%, engagement goes up, retention goes up, and we know that those are metrics that really matter to the bottom line of your business. It's beyond just how many people completed a training program. This is about looking at the results in the business. And we know that it's challenging, right? So Chip?
Yeah, and so to jump in on that, in fact, if you've been given the mission to help develop a leadership development program, in particular one for frontline managers, it can be a little confusing to be put in that role, because on the one hand, you may hear comments like those on the left. Boy, this is really a very difficult transition to make. There's some research that says of that pyramid of leadership transitions we looked at a minute ago, the one on the bottom, from individual performer to frontline manager, is one of the two tough ones, and the other one is the one at the top. And the transitions in the middle are, while they are significant transitions, they're simply not as difficult. And so, that means that we need to put some fairly rigorous way in place to help people make that transition. And many organizations feel like they do want a dramatic improvement. They want to get the kind of numbers that Cammy just referred to. At the same point, there can be a little bit of a question from the business leaders of, you're going to make this easy on me, aren't you? So while it's absolutely critical and while it's going to be tough, you're way and you're going to put people in a box, and then when they come out, they're going to be ready to perform for me. And by the way, you're not going to put them in that box very long. Is that right? So it can be a challenging place to be put. And, it's often the case we found in our discussions that companies can struggle with this.
Yeah, and, the data shows, and I'm sure for those of us who've been put into this new role, is that 60% of new frontline managers really underperform those first 2 years. Does it really take that long to get up to speed as a new manager? And then what's happening, to all those other business metrics that matter during that time of, underperformance? Another really interesting statistic is, we put people through all these training programs, and yet 41% of the training for frontline leadership development doesn't get applied back on the job. So are we just pouring money down a hole that's, kind of a black hole with frontline leadership training? And we think there's got to be a better way, right? This is a tense situation for us to all be in. How do we resolve the tension between what the business leadership wants and what we can actually do as training and development professionals? This is hard, and I think it really does represent, perhaps a new paradigm.
And so today we'll jump in to look at some ideas. If that's the situation where we're saying, from our conversations, from our review of the research, absolutely critical need that can have really significant business impact. At the same point, a lot of what's being done today isn't as effective as we'd like it to be. Well, how can we do better? And today what we'll do is we'll try to take a look at some ideas for just how we can do better. That'll start out with the conversation of, what we see is 3 gaps from talking with those responsible for leadership development programs, reporting back what we hear from them about what's holding them back from being able to perform better today. And then we'll share some thoughts for how to close those gaps. So just to jump in to the first gap, and perhaps the most significant of the gap, is from our holding conversations with leadership development professionals. What we have heard repeatedly is that there is, my slide is auto-advancing, so I'll pause here. But what we've heard repeatedly is this learning-doing gap. And what we mean by the learning-doing gap is, we're talking to leadership development professionals, we've heard, when we target the frontline managers in our business, we know what skills we want them to have. It's not rocket science. We want them to be able to set clear expectations. We want them to be able to coach their people. We want them to be able to empower their employees. We know what skills that we want them to have. And in fact, we are able to mobilize good content for those skills. We know how we want them to do it. It's not rocket science. They're trainable skills. And in fact, we're able to bring them in and offer them what we think of as quality training experiences. So, oftentimes that's bringing people in for a workshop. We're able to bring people in, give them a workshop. We're able to have them say nice things to us at the end of the workshop. The challenge with that learning-doing gap, and I'll just flip back to the slide for a second, it will advance on its own in a minute, is once we bring them to that edge of that cliff that we just saw, and then we end our workshop with a call to action. Can you please go back and apply these skills on the job? And what we find is that participants often fall off a cliff at that point. That at that point, they're back on the job, that they've appreciated the training that they've gotten. At the same point, when they go back on the job, actually applying it to their day-to-day may be number 10 on their priority list. The nature of being a frontline manager is often that you are quite challenged, and that if you're able to get through your top 2 priorities during the course of the day, well, that's a good day. And so the notion that we should work on developing our skills and intentionally applying and deliberately practicing those skills that we learned in that great training session can be something that we love to be able to do but never quite get around to. And so that gap of how do we get beyond simply being able to target the right skills, being able to provide great content for those skills, but be able to have folks actually apply those skills on the job and therefore really develop proficiency on the job is the first of three gaps that we've seen in our conversations with leadership development professionals. The second gap,
the second gap is this connection gap that we've been looking at for a few moments here. The connection gap is really talking about that role between the connection between the manager and the employee, or in this case, the new frontline leader. You know, when we're trying to demonstrate proficiency and ensure proficiency back on the job, how are we going to do that? Well, the obvious answer is that your manager, you know, the new frontline leader's manager, is there as a coach, is watching them, and is helping, you know, is helping demonstrate that proficiency, or the new frontline leader should be able to demonstrate that proficiency to their manager, right? Because that's the person who is right there, shoulder to shoulder with them, providing that daily support. And there's really been, you know, over the years, you know, the training department goes out and puts these great frontline leadership programs out in place, and it's kind of taken the responsibility off the manager. I don't have to be involved. The training department's doing that. But we know that that is so critical. And I think one of the things that we've been finding in our work over the last year is that we can use technology now in some smart ways to pull that manager back in and close that connection gap so they become part of the development process. And that's a bit of what we're going to talk about today.
And then the third of the three gaps that we've been talking about is what we call the results gap. And this comes from the conversations we've had. We ask professionals, learning the development professionals, how do you know how well your system is working today? What can you tell us about what the results have been? And you know, clearly measurement is a large issue across all areas of learning and development. When it comes to developing frontline managers, you know, typically what we hear back is, you know, we actually don't have a lot of data. We are able to have smile sheets, level 1 evaluations from the sessions that we run, and we get positive scores on that, but at the same point, we don't necessarily get positive feedback from the business sponsors about the demonstrated results they see back on the job. And so, you know, what the slide here illustrates is, you know, a simple way of trying to put together a bit of a causal story for, well, what is it that we're actually investing to accomplish, and are we accomplishing it? You know, working backwards from the business results in the bottom right, it's, you know, let's get clear about why is it that we're investing in the front line in the first place. You know, oftentimes that has to do with some fairly basic, are we keeping our people, are they feeling engaged? And we have data from the business already about that. Sometimes it's, are we successfully implementing some changes we have in mind? And usually the business has data about how well those changes go as well. So, you know, sort of the starting point is, are we getting the business results we're seeking? Usually the data for that comes from the business itself. You know, in the middle, it's, well, the way we think we're going to get those business results is we're going to target a set of skills that we want our frontline leaders to be able to perform systematically on the job. And, you know, that's often a missing piece of the story. Do we actually have some data that says, have we reached the level of proficiency that we're seeking? And we'll talk a little bit about that today. And then finally, you know, there's kind of activity data on the lower left, which is, are we doing the work that's required to move the needle on what our proficiency results are? So, you know, one gap that we've heard is that, that those who lead leadership development programs would love to be able to tell themselves and tell their leaderships a causal story that says, are we doing the work? If we are doing the work, are we getting the results in terms of gained proficiency? If we're getting the results in terms of gained proficiency, well, we invested in a certain set of capabilities. Are those capabilities actually delivering the results? And so that's the third gap. First one is, how do we get people to actually take what we're using and not fall off the cliff, but instead cross the learning doing gap? Second one is, how do we connect you to managers? And the third one is, how can we get some visibility on what's working and what's not working?
Great. So we think we can do better. We know that we can do better, and we know that our frontline managers can do better. And it's really about changing that fundamental question, as Chip has been saying. So instead of, you know, taking the angle of, you know, putting great content out there and giving people these great development experiences, what if we can change that question so that we're really asking, you know, what if we're insisting that frontline managers demonstrate that proficiency on the job? So it's not about putting the content in front of them. And it's about demonstrating that proficiency and then sharing those results back. So it's a tall bar, we know that, but we can do it. So it's moving from this providing training mindset to ensuring results mindset. And I think hopefully you're all nodding your heads and you're saying, yeah, this is something that we've been trying to do. And we're going to walk you through now. Chip's going to lead us off now with just looking at some of the 4 principles that we're going to apply to closing those gaps that we've been talking about.
So far, thanks, Cammy. So far, we've given you kind of the view of the world that we've heard about what's holding us back from doing better with frontline manager programs. And if you have questions about that, feel free to type in some questions and we can address them as we go forward. What we're going to do now is shift gears a little bit and say, what do we see as far as techniques, ideas we can put in place to be able to do better, to be able to close those gaps. And we'll go through these one at a time. The first one is, well, oftentimes we think of frontline management development, what we can do from the learning and development program is to provide a program. That program may be a series of workshops, their events. How can we convert from that mindset towards more of a change journey mindset that has steps along the way where we can see proficiency develop? The second is addressing that gap with the collaboration gap. How can we pragmatically bring not only the audience, the new frontline managers into the fold, but how can we build a learning partnership between them and their managers in order to really get to the point where we're demonstrating proficiency on the job? That means that we can no longer leave a call to action after our training to say, please go practice, but how can we really build that into the middle of the journeys that we're trying to provide? And then as part of that, how can we instrument what we're doing to be able to make results visible so that we can see if we're getting the gains we hope for and we can see what to fix if we're not? So why don't we begin to walk through those? And so on this one, what we've seen when we talk to leadership development professionals is more often than not, the way that a frontline management development program will work is that we take our best and brightest individual performers, we promote them into a frontline management role. Sometimes that's what they've been seeking from the start. Sometimes that's not something they've considered before. That's where you can get your kind of accidental frontline manager. Like Cammy was talking about the accidental instructional designer. Typically we do provide them some support, some training program, and then we give them that call to action. We set them loose, and we hope they apply it on the job. We hope their managers support them. We hope we get some data that shows that this is working. And what we've heard kind of consistently is that oftentimes that these hopes don't turn into realities. What we've thought about doing, therefore, is shifting that from a system that's built on hoping good things happen outside of the training we provide to trying to build a systematic journey that really wires in what we want to happen as part of that journey. And so this kind of complicated chart is a summary of what we see as the structure of such a journey, a repeatable process that we can ask frontline managers to go through that will enable them to, by the time they're finished with the journey, demonstrate proficiency on the job with their team. The goal that Cammy set for us a few minutes ago. Just to give you a quick heads up on the nature of this journey, there's really 4 major legs to the road that we've mapped out: some preparation work for the journey, some actual focused learning inside the journey, the section of the road where we practice and apply with the team, and then at the end reflecting to see if we've actually gotten the gains we hope to get. So to walk through the road stations along the way of the road, the landmarks, that's oftentimes if we're setting out to tackle a skill. Let's say we're setting out to help a frontline manager develop the skill with clearly setting expectations. Well, let's start out with a little welcome. Let's help them understand what's in it for them in order to how setting clear expectations can help their team and actually make their job easier, help the team produce better outputs. From that, what we have come to believe is that instead of us bringing them in to arm them with better skills right away, it's better for us to send them out to go work with their team to gather some input about what works well and what doesn't work well for providing feedback with their team. So this gather input stage says, until you feel like you have a clear handle on where you are, you're not going to be really that ready to take advantage of the learning we'll provide. Let's have you go out and talk to your team members and gather some input. After that, let's have you, based on that data, assess yourself and give you a behavior-based assessment. So high value practices in setting expectations, here are 15 of them. How often when you set expectations do you follow these practices? That can help give you a picture of what good means and where you are. And what we found in taking people through this process is by the end of it, a few will say, you know what, I'm actually pretty good at setting expectations. Please don't take my time. And we think that actually that if their managers agree with them about that, that's a valid thing and we can let them go. But what we find is that's not the common case. Most people say, oh, you know what, I actually do understand that this is going to help me and my team, and I have some pretty specific goals about it at that point. So in short, by taking people through that first prepare leg of the road, what we're able to do is to turn them into pretty motivated, self-directed adult learners who have a goal in mind. And then that takes us down into learning. We'll spend a lot of time on the learning phase. That's where we've already shown as an industry, we're really pretty good at sort of tackling that phase, and there's a number of ways of going about it. And then coming out of that, what we do is we have them discuss their progress. Cammy will talk a little bit more about that, but that's a place where we involve the manager and begin to build that learning partnership. All of that is really preparation for what we see as the heart of the journey, the green leg, which is practicing with your team. And what we found is it's useful to put a quite structured process in place with very clear expectations about just what we mean when we say apply it on the job. We've moved to a structured approach of having people practice on the job 3 times for each skill, put them through a cycle of prepare, do, reflect for each of those times, and be able to actually share the results back with their managers. And then on the basis of that, that leads down into the final phase of reflecting. We had some goals that we set up front and prepare. Did we achieve those goals? Is there more work to be done? Again, learning partnership with the manager to review the journey, and if successful, on to the next skill that we want to prepare. So relatively long description, but really the heart of some of the ideas that we're seeing to cross those gaps is this conversion from, instead of bringing people in for a training event, arming them with best practices, sending them out into the world, will it work better for us to get to demonstrated proficiency if we go through a kind of structured approach that says, let's prepare, help you form your own personal goal for how you'd like to improve a skill. Let's enable you to improve your skill, but then let's actually have you practice, demonstrate to yourself, demonstrate to your manager, demonstrate to us that you can perform that skill, reflect on whether we've reached or not. And that's the process we'll go through to get to demonstrated proficiency.
So I think
Cammy, let me turn that over to you to talk a little bit. Oh, in fact, actually, I'm sorry. I think this is one that I'll cover. So, part of that is the journey. I mentioned the phrase learning partnership with your manager, and really when we spoke to organizations about how to develop frontline managers, we heard 2 what seemed like quite contradictory things. We heard, first, it's absolutely vital that we get managers involved. If we want to be able to have frontline managers take the time to practice their skills and do so thoughtfully, we are not going to systematically be able to get that done unless their line managers are engaged with them. And in fact, if we don't get the line managers engaged, the line managers can harm our results both through neglect, but also simply by giving different instructions. So we need to get our managers involved. At the same point, we heard we need to do that, but we also heard all sorts of concerns like the ones mentioned on the slide. They may not have the skills, they haven't been through a program like this themselves. Some of them are quite operationally minded. Others may be developmentally minded and really feel like they want to coach, but others may be operationally minded. And then finally, the third is, boy, do they have the skills to be able to coach. And what we've come to is an approach which is based on the notion that, yes, we do want to form that learning partnership, but the way we'll form that learning partnership is to put in place a quite structured process. There's really a couple of practices behind that. The first of those practices is when we're asking managers of participants, the second line managers, to be able to contribute to their frontline managers' performance, we're not asking them to be subject matter experts in how to give feedback, how to coach, how to set expectations, how to monitor progress. We're really asking them to be a guide and a mentor. And so we're not, so one is that we're offloading the notion that, you will not turn to your manager for the best practices and how to do that. We'll provide that in the learning leg of the journey. But what we'll ask you to do is really support your team member, and we'll give you the tools to be able to do that. So that's the first. The second has to do with actually providing some legs and accountability to that. So Cammy, let me see if you want to talk to that.
Yeah, sure. So I think that accountability is so important, and we're at a place now where technology can help support that, right? We want the participant manager to be along on this journey. We're not saying you have to be expert in this skill, but we want them to go along for the ride, and to they're going to have tick points along the way too that we want to hold them accountable to. So that's really a critical role as we see it, and it's a real difference from that hope method that Chip was talking about earlier, where we send people off into the world and they fall off this cliff. Now we're saying, hey, manager, you need to be involved in this. So learning and development can try to take on those roles. They could try to be that kind of guide on the side going forward, but that's costly, and it's often very counterproductive if you're trying to form that positive relationship between a new frontline manager and their manager. So we're really hoping to cement that relationship more. And Chip will probably talk about this a little bit, but we've seen as we put this into practice that people are really taking advantage of this and building on this relationship in some very key ways that are really, really important. So, so we want to treat that participant's manager as a partner, and we're going to embed that into the experience that we're creating. And we see that goes a long way to kind of demonstrating those results. And one of the ways that we can do that is to organize things into what we're calling, moments of truth. Managers can't take over the development of their frontline leaders, right? So they're not going to become those experts, but we can create a system in which they can operate. So part of this is breaking it down into something more digestible and easier for the manager. In this case, I mean the manager of the new frontline employee. And so we're going to ask them, kind of boiling down what we're asking of them into these clear moments of truth. We're going to give them some simple missions, and we're going to provide a lot of guidance and structure. So for example, what does that look like? Well, we can ask them to meet with frontline managers to review that self-assessment that Chip was talking about, and give them support and structure to guide that conversation. So they can have a really open conversation with that structure. And as we move along, thinking about how we're going to give that manager support. So we're not going to ask them to be, know everything, but we want to give them points, structure along the way, guides that we can, so that they're going to succeed and they're going to learn in the process as well. Chip, anything you want to add for that? And then I'm going to ask us to pause because we do have a couple of questions that I want to respond to. So.
Just before we pause, just to wrap up on that. I mean, you had mentioned our experience with this, and what we found is by taking that kind of journey structure and making it a repeatable structure that we use for different skills, but it's a predictable structure, that participants and the second line managers get used to that structure. There are a couple of moments in there where we provide what we call check-ins in that structure. And what we found is that if we're able to provide the two kinds of support that are shown on the slide at this point, one, some data about how has the participant been progressing, what have they found as they've gone through the previous slides, which we use the technology to gather. And the second is some just like if I'm running a check-in meeting, what are the 5 things I should make sure to cover, and what are some questions I can ask during that meeting? So a little bit of a job aid for how to run that meeting. That gets second line managers the comfort that they can be effective in development. And while we originally saw this as a risk point for can we actually have managers have the discipline to follow through with this kind of activity, what we've seen in practice is that it's less of a risk point than we had anticipated. And in fact, many second line managers, once we've given them this kind of scaffolding, once we've given them these easy steps into how they can have performance conversations with their frontline managers, have found that they quite enjoy it. And they go well beyond the level of the sort of 2 check-ins that we wire in, and it becomes part of their natural interactions with their team members as they move forward. let me pause there, Cammy, because I think you mentioned wanting to come back to some questions.
Yeah, so James has a question, and I think this is going back to, back a few slides where we were talking about the gaps. And he says, would another principle for closing the gaps be identify the professional needs of the target audience, also perhaps what motivates the target audience? And I think there's a lot to be said for that, James, and really that's what we see happening in that in the prepare stage. So I don't know, Chip, if it makes sense to jump back to slide 18 in the deck.
Sure, let me see if I can do that.
And I think really, as Chip was talking and describing what activities are happening in that prepare stage, it is about motivating that target audience, right? It's helping them understand what their gaps are, helping them understand, wow, I really thought I knew a lot about this, but actually I don't. Or I'm going out in the field and I'm talking to my team and I'm hearing things that, maybe I really do need to be working on this skill. I thought I was good. So we think in that prepare stage, we're really getting into that motivation in a really essential way. Chip, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, I think
great. Yeah, just to add, just a little color commentary on that is the journey we're looking at here, what we found to be successful is to use that journey for relatively contained skills. How do I give feedback? How do I monitor performance? How do I coach? There's sort of two levels of motivation. One is, as a frontline manager, do I believe I need support with that skill? And then what specific support do I need? And a lot of what we do during the prepare phase is help you identify what specific support do I need during the skill. I think the question that James asked can also be used at the level above that, which is what set of skills do I need to work on? And one area where I think we don't have a lot to say yet, frankly, I think it's an interesting area, is how do we balance the tension between a top-down business perspective that says all frontline managers must have the following set of 12 skills, and a bottom-up perspective that says I, as an individual frontline manager, am actually pretty good at the first 6 of those skills. I think I want the second 6 of those skills, plus there's 2 that I think I really need help with that aren't on the list, and how can I have them, please? And so one of the areas that we've been thinking about, and I'd say we are not yet at the point of having a real point of view about it, is how do we balance the selection and motivation behind, do we target the right skills at a personalized level for each frontline manager, as opposed to have a systematic approach that develops all the skills the business needs? And then once we get inside each of those skills, this approach of using that whole prepare phase, I think, has actually worked well for us to be able to say, oh, now I have a kind of a laser focus on just what I want to get better at when I'm working on how to give feedback to a team member.
I'll just jump in there too. That kind of skills identification, or that gap, I'm going to share just a little anecdote and hopefully not get too off into a tangent. But one of our clients is creating a leadership. It's a leadership development program for their senior leaders, and they're calling it an offering, I think, which is really interesting. They're not, the L&D team is creating it. They're calling it an offering. They're not calling it a training program. But the first step is that the developing leader sits down with his or her manager and identifies what those gaps are together. So it becomes a very self-directed process. And they say, well, you need to work on financial acumen, and you need to work on this area, you need to work on these, these kind of competencies. They're kind of focusing in it that way. And then the learner goes off with his or her manager and selects from a huge library of assets. They're using, they're pulling in off-the-shelf content from lynda.com. We're developing custom content for them in a number of areas. They've got other things that they're developing internally, books that people could read, and now allowing someone to choose from this whole library about how they want to develop that particular skill. So I think we're seeing a lot more self-direction, and it was really encouraging to see this particular organization pulling that, the manager in, and these are really senior level roles that they're trying to groom people for, that, succession planning kind of an idea. So I don't know if that gets a little bit to that, but I think there's some shifts. It'd be interesting to hear what, you folks out in the audience are doing in that area too. How are you identifying what skills people need to develop? We'd love to hear your thoughts. So feel free to jump in and ask a question or type something in chat along those lines if you have something to experience. James is asking, I think to that point, as I was just saying, you're saying, do you curate the content resources to make it easier for them to manage the learning process? In the example that I was sharing, absolutely. What the job of the L&D team is to provide a library of kind of, of curated content that says, hey, these are all materials that we have vetted and we think will help build skills. Now you can choose from this library of vetted content. So the L&D team still has a role, but it's a little less prescriptive in some ways, and putting in the opportunity for people to kind of go out and build and choose. So.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, I think an interesting combination would be if we're starting with that bottom-up approach to identify target skills based on individual priorities, and we're supporting that with some curated content so we don't have to painstakingly craft all the content. How can we also combine that with the idea of work actually gets done in the field and the notion of the journey? So I think that's a sort of interesting way to think about how do we combine something that is, a little bit bottom up, and in particular on making sure we focus on the right things, and has a little bit too of that repeated structure that how can we see that we're actually getting results on the things we focus on.
Yeah, and before we move on a little bit more, I think good to pause and just say, hey, ask you folks in the crowd, what do you think? Chip's the way he kind of initially set it up, that the model of hope, crossing our fingers. We put this great training out there and crossing our fingers and hoping. Does that feel familiar? Is that what's happening in organizations? Have you already started moving towards more of this kind of journey mindset with leadership development? Does anyone have a point of view on that? Does it feel familiar? Does it feel like a direction that is kind of naturally occurring right now? Or does anyone have thoughts on that? We'd love to hear from that. So we can come back to that, but I'll let Chip, you can kind of move on now.
Great.
Yeah, before I derail us completely, yeah.
No worries. Sounds good. I appreciate the question. That's very interesting. I think the second sort of question about laying out this journey approach comes up is if we do try to work people through that kind of journey that has that big green practice stretch of the road. Now we're moving away from having folks come in to do a little bit of training. We have control over that and sending them back into the field to something that's going to stretch out over a longer period of time. And in particular, if we want them to apply on the job, that means that we're going to take more of their time than we have previously. And how can we possibly take the time from these people who are already overworked, have them go away and invest significant amounts of hours in this development work? That's going against a little bit of some of the business pressures we get from our business sponsors. And so that challenge, I think, is a challenge that comes up when one begins to think about this approach of using a structured journey that embeds practice. And it turns out that what we found when we've tried to apply this in practice is that there's a kind of happy happenstance that happens for us, which is that with the skills that we're talking about, they tend to be day in and day out skills that frontline managers use all the time on the job. So I love this picture of enabling a firefighting team to figure out how to hone their skills, and in which they have to go and have fancy gear and or burn down an abandoned house. They have to create some very special circumstance for them to be able to practice. What we're finding is we don't need to do that. In fact, what we can do is simply say, let's use the experience you're having every week now in setting expectations for your team and enabling your team members and coaching. Let's use that every week. These are skills that you should be using with your team, and we can simply ride on the back. What we'll do is we'll put a little bit of a structure and reflection around it to convert what's going by you, perhaps a little bit of stream of consciousness you're trying to survive your day, into a deliberate practice learning experience. And so we found that being able to take that approach has really been able to make this approach pragmatic. And part of that, I think, is using it to drive a bit of a systematic learning cycle. Cammy, I don't know if you wanted to jump in there.
I do. I like jumping in.
please.
Yeah, and I think this wiring and deliberate practice, it's happening out in the real world. So we pull people out of the event, right? This is no longer just a 3-day classroom training or a week-long classroom training, but we're kind of embedding this out in the process. As Chip was saying, you're out in the real world, and you have an issue with an employee this week, and you need to provide feedback. So you're going to go out and do it, and do this practice, and we'll provide some structure and guidance to help them through that process. But what's so important ultimately is that last stage too, is that reflect stage, right? We want to make sure that people are reflecting on how their behavior is going to change. Was it worth making the change? We want to give them, mindful time to do this. Mindful time. I just made that up. So if we go on to the next slide here, and we're looking at that kind of the green practice stage, right? We said in the past, the old model, we provide great training, and we hope that participants apply it back on the job. We get them back onto the job. Now we want them to apply what they learn. So if we're embedding this into the training, it's just part of this whole roadmap, right? It's part of this journey and this experience. So moving, Chip, as we think about making that space for practice, right? It's often a little bit contrived when you're in a classroom session because it's a role play or something like that. But here we're trying to put it out into the real world. It's not just practice. It's what you need to do to your job, right? So it's kind of the stakes matter a little bit more, and it's not just role play. It's real. This is your team that you're helping give feedback to, et cetera. So wiring that in, really important, and then that reflection stage is going to be part of that last part of the journey, but we see that so closely tied to the practice.
Well, and just to add to that, I mean, one of the things I think we found by trying to apply this model is there is that jump from a training experience to a real-world experience. And even when we do great role plays in the classroom, having participated in those role plays, that you're in kind of a certain mindset. You're feeling a little silly doing this in front of 30 people, but it's kind of a fake situation. Even if it's a really great, engaging role play, it can get your blood pressure up and you get engaged in the situation. But just what the felt experience is for that versus then when you go back on the job and you try to do the same thing, even if you ace the role play in the training experience, going back and sitting down with an actual team member with whom you have an ongoing relationship, who's expecting you to be their manager and lead them forward in the future, and trying to apply that is a big mental step. And I think what we found in this notion of don't make it an afterthought is if we as the learning organization can set up a structure in which I as an individual frontline manager am going to be asked to stand up and do something with the team member 3 times is the number we've landed on. I'm not sure that there's science behind the 3 times. There's a little bit of art. The first time I do that, and I try to apply that model that you gave me for how to give feedback, your 4-step model for how to give feedback with an actual team member, boy, is that hard. That's a big mental leap. And so, the fact that we can get you to stand up and put a system in place where you're going to do that and reflect on it, make those results visible to your manager so there's some accountability for it, is a big step forward. And oftentimes the victory there isn't so much that you've shown that you can apply the model. It's only your first time. The victory is you've demonstrated to yourself that actually you can try using the model in the real world and nothing breaks. And it's really not until you do it the second time, maybe do it the third time, that you begin to see, you know what, I can see how this is beginning to help me improve my performance. I'm beginning to see which parts I can do and which I can't do. And that's an amount of practice which comes up fairly naturally in the course of the day-to-day. And so, that's kind of a little bit of the psychology behind what we've discovered as we've tried to put this model into place.
Great.
Cammy, should I go ahead? Yeah, I'll go ahead to the 4th result, unless you wanted to add any more on top of my adding on top of you.
No, I think we've added plenty on top of. We are getting some great comments in the questions pod, and people are feeling like this is very familiar. This kind of method of hope that is out there, kind of the old school way of doing things. So and that this journey approach really seems like it has some traction to it. So that's great to hear. And we'll come back to those comments later and can dive into them a little bit more deeply. So please keep the questions and the comments coming, and we'll hopefully have a little bit of time. So I'll let Chip get through the rest of it and stop interrupting him.
No, that's okay. I appreciate it. Sure. So, well, we're actually down to the fourth of the 4 practices we talked about. And so this one is about really making results visible. You know, I'll give a little bit of backstory to this. So one, you know, as we found as we begin to adopt this journey mindset, it does take what sometimes was previously a one-step process, bring them to training, send them forward with hope. And it makes it into a multiple-step process that we apply for multiple skills. So just the level of complexity in the system goes up as we try to reach the goal of demonstrated proficiency on the job. You know, we've also found that using a technology platform, something we haven't talked about a lot today, to enable that and make it clear to people where are you and what have you done and what results did you get, and be able to share that in an efficient way, provides a lot of accountability to push that process forward. But the other thing we found about it is that the relationship between the learning department and the business begins to change. I mean, oftentimes when we launch leadership development programs over the years, you know, the notion is, well, as with any program, we'd like the business leadership to take ownership over the program and help make sure it happens in the program. And you know, the answers that we get over time from business leaders are typically, sure, sounds good. Don't exactly know what you mean by that. I'm not sure exactly what the mechanics of that are, but I'm happy to do that. But when we move towards having this multi-step process, we can begin to make that role of business management very clear, which is, you know, your job is to help us identify the business results we want. Our job is to put a journey structure in place that gives a platform whereby individuals can develop the skills that we target. We're going to need time from your managers to be able to support the journey process and form that learning partnership. We should provide a practical system that will make that easy on them. And then what we're going to ask you to do is make sure that once we do our part, that your business leaders do your part. And so that means that we're going to want to be able to put in place a system that provides some visibility, and we can give you, Mr. Business Sponsor, some very clear data about, in fact, the sales organization is executing flawlessly, the operations team is executing flawlessly except in the South region, and by the way, there are some sporadic problems with the R&D organization that we can point you to, and we'd like you to be able to reach out to the organization to help us make sure we have the discipline. In order for us to do that, it means that we need to put a pretty rigorous evaluation system in place to be able to make it clear where are we. And I'll share a little bit, in fact, we'll share a little bit about what that looks like. So the first part of that is really just defining to everybody, business sponsorship, all the way down to me as a frontline manager trying to work my way through this. What does it mean to be good? And so this, you know, I think we don't have rocket science around this. It's really something that's been known for a long time. The better job we can do to create a clear behavioral model about what good means, the better we can be comfortable that, yes, our business sponsors believe that developing those capabilities will provide the business results we're looking at. And yes, our participants will understand what we actually want them to do. So the first step of that is to be able to define what good means at a fairly specific behavioral level. We showed up front in the journey where we expose participants to this relatively early in the process. It's not the first thing we have them do. We have them go out and gather a little data with their team first so they have some context to work in. We have them do this, and then in a few steps we have them talk about this with their manager. So, you know, first step is defining what good means. That launches us off and to say, then we're preparing ourselves to tell a coherent story. If our goal is to develop those behaviors in order to get these business results, this is the story that we talked about before. And by using technology to make it easy for individuals to work with their managers to track their way through these journeys, we're able to gather some really great data about where are we in simply having discipline following the work. So that lower left box of we are doing the work. Are people completing the number of journeys in the time frame we'd like? Are they completing them on time? Are they getting through the work? Where are they falling off the work if they're not? Who specifically, under what circumstances? all that becomes quite visible, so we can get some good data on that. Oftentimes, what we found is that, that kind of data about activity levels is, oftentimes something that learning and development groups have been pretty good over the years at gathering. But the middle bar of, and did we get the results we seek, is one where there's often not so much data. And the way we found that we can take a step towards trying to get that information on the table now is through this notion of, if we show you those best practices and ask you to evaluate your performance on it, and ask you, based on your performance on those, give yourself a number from 1 to 10 where you stand, we begin to get a sense of what you as an individual frontline manager feel where you are in terms of your performance. If we then ask you to share that with your manager, we have a little bit of meat behind that number. And in fact, what we've actually gotten requests for, as we're thinking about moving this forward, is if we can move that more into a 360 model, we have some pretty decent data about whether or not we're actually getting to the proficiency level. That with the goal, as we mentioned at the start of the webinar, if we're able to drive that proficiency level, that in turn should, over a course of the coming months, drive the business results we're looking for. So that notion of being able to make the connection is something that we feel is really important, both to help at the activity level. Can we get at a granular level where people are doing the work and where they aren't? Can we engage our business leaders in helping to encourage that? All the way through, can we identify where in the story things are working for us and where in the story things aren't working? So, Cammy, let me turn it back to you just to begin to wrap up the story and see what open questions we have.
Yeah, fantastic. So, as we've talked about this sort of shift that we're making, so we're going from a training mindset where we put it out there and we hope and we cross our fingers, maybe close our eyes a little bit and just pray that people aren't falling off a cliff, to this more results-focused mindset, where we're really looking at helping people achieve proficiency, get better at their jobs, and ultimately impact the bottom line. We've talked today about really these 4 kind of key principles that we are looking and building into our leadership development program. So one is this shift from an event to a journey. And it's been great in the comments. Some of you have shared that this is a journey that you're already on. You are shifting from a journey to a journey. No, you've already shifted to a journey mindset. So James has shared that they're embracing spaced repetition, action plans developed with a coach, related strategies to apply what was learned in formal learning events back on the job. There's a lot happening here. People are already moving in this direction, and we love this. The second piece was wiring in collaboration with managers. I think we've got a timer on the slide. Chip, can you go back? Because I'm still wrapping up.
Sure.
Wiring in that collaboration with managers, so making sure that managers are part of this process and that they're accountable. And we can use technology to do that. A lot of LMSs allow for that, and we want to build that in. That deliberate practice, which is out in the real world. It's not just role plays. It's the real deal, where the skills matter, and using your feedback and your tools that you're learning as part of this journey in real time with real people to impact the business. And then finally, step 4 is making those results visible. So we want to have a data-driven approach that's going to give you the evidence that shows, wow, what we're doing is having an impact on that bottom line. And that's so important. So those are the kind of the 4 cornerstones of the approach that we've been taking. And the mindset, now we can move ahead, Chip. The mindset is really, how to transfer leadership development, and perhaps, this is kind of a before and after, right? In the old mindset, we're going to train you. Now we want to move to, you're going to demonstrate proficiency. That's the outcome that we want people to be focused on. From this mindset of we're in charge, we're the L&D folks, to you and your manager are the accountable ones. We'll help manage the system. We might be curating the content. We're putting great stuff out there, but it's ultimately you and your manager who are accountable for what's happening at that business level. From this mindset of, you will participate in a list of activities, or events. So you're going to work through a change journey. You've got, there's a process here, and we're looking, not just at a week-long experience or a 2-day experience, but it might be a month. It might be a couple of months that you're working through this process, because we know that learning and behavior change takes time. We're moving from a we hope you're going to use what you learn philosophy or mentality to, actually applying these new skills. That's part of the journey that's built into this process that we're doing. Moving from this, we're going to judge you by giving you a test at the end, which is a test. It's not real world, right? To actually rating performance on the job. That's what really matters, how people are doing with this skill in the real world. We're moving from this fingers crossed, this is the last one here, this kind of fingers crossed, eyes closed, hoping, you know, where we're not really sure what's happening after training, to we actually have a balanced scorecard that we can report out results at the end. This is a shift, and Alexis was sharing something in the content, the chat, just saying, you know, one of the challenges in her organization is they've got 19 centers out there, and they can't measure what's working in all of them. So we want to have a better answer to that measurement, and having a scorecard that we can report back on is really a key to that. Great. So we've got a couple minutes left here to wrap up. I think, you know, any questions for us, anything that you want to dive in more deeply. We realize we've covered a lot today. It's been a dense hour. We will have recordings and the slides available, but feel free to ask a few questions right now if you have any. I'm just looking through the questions right now. James has been sharing that as his organization has been moving to this more of a journey mindset, that they're having good results. And it's really driving a cultural change within the organization. And of course, that takes time. And I think that's a really good point, James. This is you know, it's not only a mindset change for L&D, but for the people on, you know, the receiving end, you know, our quote unquote learners who are, you know, perhaps used to the model of going to a classroom and, you know, training will happen and voila, we will all learn. And for the managers as well. So we're really shifting it's a cultural shift, giving you more accountability for your own performance and your manager along with that, and creating a very different experience for people. Chip, I'll bring it back to you to kind of wrap us up.
Well, I'd just like to say thanks to everybody for joining. Really appreciate you joining today. You know, really good comments for us as we've gone along. If you do have further questions for us, or you have further thoughts on what we presented, we'd love to be able to leverage and learn from your experience. So please feel free to reach out. As Cammy mentioned up front, we did record today. We'll be publishing the recording. It'll probably come out near the end of next week. And if you do happen to be at ATD ICE, we'd love to see you there. So thanks for joining. Why don't we wrap up for the day, and very much appreciate you coming today. Hope you found it interesting.
Thanks, everyone.